Welcome, this is Chef Jack, and this week we're going to be talking about cooking methods. And with this video, I will try to go a little bit quicker than I normally have, just to keep you all engaged now that you kind of have a hang of it. So, we're going to start with cooking methods. After this session, you should be able to identify different cooking methods. State the relationship between textures, cooking time, and cooking method. The advantages and disadvantages of different cooking methods, and being aware of the safe handling rules associated with different cooking methods. So I put up this chart just as kind of so obviously this is a cow or a steer. And, you don't think of it, and, you've got the chuck, the rib, the short loin, the sirloin, tenderloin, and the round. And it's different cuts of meat, but depending on where that cut is coming from, it will also help determine the cooking method. So up front by the chuck roast, that's more, think of that as your shoulder. There's a lot of moving muscles there. Every time it walks, it's standing, it's using its shoulder to stay in place. So that type of cooking method you'd use would be more of a moist cooking method, because that helps break down some of the connective tissue. We're going across the back, the rib, the sirloin, where you find that filet, the New York, the prime rib. That doesn't get a lot of movement, and that's more of a tender cut. And you could use the other type of cooking method, which is dry heat. And dry heat doesn't break down a lot of cooking connective tissue, but it adds a lot of flavor. So that's, and also down below you got the shank or ossobuco, which would come from the veal. Those are all more working, so you need moist heat for that. So you got the two cooking methods: moist heat and dry heat. Moist heat is those in which the heat is conducted to the food product by water or other liquids. Dry heat is the heat is conducted by hot air. And then sometimes you have a combination of cooking methods. If you can think of one where you use both dry and moist heat. Ding 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 ding. And time's up. And if you think of braising, first you sear the meat, get it nice and browned on all sides using the Maillard reaction, and then you cover it and then finish it, and it's more of a moist heat. So sometimes you do use both cooking methods. First, we'll talk about baking and roasting, which is a dry heat method. And term baking usually applies to breads, pastries, vegetables, and fish. Roasting usually applies to meats and poultry. You don't roast a pie. The other thing is, sometimes people will say, oh, vegetables, you don't bake vegetables, it's oven roasted vegetables or oven roasted potatoes. It just sounds better, but technically that's called baking. If you call it roasted asparagus, you can charge a little bit more on the menu, so we like that. Cooking on a spit in front of an open fire may also be considered roasting. We've got roasting is uncovered, because the covering would hold in the steam. It's usually cooked on a rack so that air can circulate underneath, or the bottom meat is not kind of boiling in its own juices. And you also want to rotate things in the oven. Even though we use convection ovens, you can still get radiation from the sides or the top of the oven, so you want to rotate your food items around, spin your sheet tray around, or sometimes put the top sheet tray into the middle and the middle one up on. Barbecuing is another type of dry heat method. Generally, you're cooking around 225 or 250 degrees. Broiler, the heat is coming from above, and grilling, the heat is coming from below. But essentially, they're the same type of heat. It's a radiant heat. And then here's some general rules for broiling. It's high heat, just the rack. You always preheat. Then you want it sears to get the nice marks. And the marks, not only their color, but they're also flavor, because that's, you're darkly searing that meat, so that does add a bit of flavor. Do coat them with just oil. You want to do a thin coat of oil. You don't want oil dripping off your meat onto the coals, because that'll ignite and then kind of give an off flavor. So just use a thin amount of oil. And then there's a salamander that you'll see in a couple of the labs, and that's really not for cooking meat. It's just for melting cheese or toasting buns. If anyone's used one, I'm sure you've burned your fair amount of buns trying to get them toasted because it is just a little bit out of eyesight. Other dry heats, so you've got grilling, griddling, which if you think of, doing a grilled cheese or pancakes is what you use a griddle. Pan broiling is very similar to griddling. Saute is the next dry heat method using a little bit of fat. Saute is to cook quickly in a small amount of fat. The French word sauteur means to jump. Preheat your pan onto high and do not overcrowd your pan. I think whenever you're sauteing something, you always want to hear that sizzle. If you're starting to overcrowd the pan, it'll drop the heat in the pan and your pan will go from a nice to a quiet. And I can, even from across the kitchen, I can tell if someone's correctly doing it or not just by the sound. Meat to be sauteed are commonly dusted with flour. If for gluten-free, you could use cornstarch, potato starch, or you don't have to use a flour or coating. But after the food is sauteed, the liquid may be used to dissolve the brown bits of food, and this is called what? Yes, the fond, the bottom of the pan, and that's a lot where some of the flavor is, and you can incorporate that into your stir frying. Is basically a variation of sauteing. It's high heat, small amount of oil. Pan frying, if you think of, probably the most common thing is pan fried chicken. You use like maybe a cast iron skillet, and the oil will come about halfway up onto the food. And sometimes you'll finish them, you'll get them turned over at least once and then finish them in the oven. Deep frying is another, you don't think of it as a dry heat method, but there's no moisture or water involved, so it technically is a dry heat. And some of the off flavors from the fat. If you ever have gone to a restaurant, say Saturday afternoon, and gotten some fries or something and it tastes like fish, well, that's because they didn't change the oil from the night before. They had a big fish fry, used the same oil, didn't filter it or anything, and then you've got fishy tasting French fries the next day. And then just some general guidelines for deep frying: fry as close to surface as possible, and then protect fat from its enemies. And what are the enemies? Some of the enemies are heat, oxygen, so you should always use your covers at night. Water's, if you've ever put water or something frozen with ice crystals on it, you'll get a explosion. So you want to remove that, because you think of it, water evaporates at what temperature? 212 degrees. It hits that 350 degree oil and immediately evaporates, but as it does that, it displaces the oil and then splatters it onto your arm. We don't like that. Salt is another thing that's bad for a fryer. And at the club, we used to change the oil twice a week. I hired a new cook, and all of a sudden we're changing it every other day. And I was like, well, what's going on here? And then I realized I was walking through the kitchen one day, and he was salting some fries right over the fryer, and all that salt. And when it takes, $60, $70 to fill up a fryer with oil, and all of a sudden you have to do it twice as much, that's a lot of money coming out of your pocket that you're just basically throwing away. Detergent, make sure you rinse well after cleaning. I had a cook do that once, didn't clean it real well, and then when he filled it up with oil and brought it up to temperature, the deep fry oil boiled over. We had several gallons of oil on the floor, which is not fun to clean up. And with that, I think it's a great place to pause before we go on to the moist heat cooking methods.